Hello, I'm Ben Jarvis. I want to share with you some of the reasons why I think that Utah is such a remarkable place. We have some of the most spectacular scenery on the planet. I don't have to tell you about the greatest snow on Earth. And our history, whether you're talking about our ancient native cultures or the exploits of the pioneers, well, it's unmatched by any of our sister states. But there's something in the human psyche that wants to be the originator, the first, and we're no exception. Utah and her people have had a significant impact that can be felt throughout the world. Our state has been home to trailblazers who have pushed the envelope of what was possible, events that could not have happened anywhere else, and people demonstrating what words like exceptional and pioneer really mean. So sit back and prepare to be amazed at some of the fun, intriguing, poignant, and world-changing stories of Utah's famous firsts.
Whew! It's been said that good ideas are common. What's uncommon are people who work hard enough to bring them about. That's something Fred Morrison learned firsthand. This disc golf course in Holiday, Utah is named in honor of Walter Frederick Morrison, who after years of experimentation, study, sweat, anguish, and, yes, even failure, finally achieved success with his invention, the Pluto Platter. And while you may not be familiar with the name Fred Morrison or the Pluto Platter, just about everyone on a playground, sporting field, or in the backyard has been impacted by his first-of-its-kind flying device.
Walter Frederick Morrison was born in the small community of Richfield, Utah, and he had a typical boyhood upbringing, did the kinds of things that kids did in the 20s. Played a lot of baseball, stickball. One of the things that caught his attention was airplanes. And Richfield had a little airstrip, and he used to go down there and hang out and watch the planes take off and land. And Fred said that kind of cemented a lifelong interest in flying and anything that could fly. In the late 30s, he met a cute girl by the name of Lucy Ney, and they started dating. And one of the things that she did was invite him to her uncle's Thanksgiving Day party.
Think about it, Martians.
After dinner, they went out into the backyard, and the uncle brought out a popcorn can lid, which they proceeded to toss about. And they had so much fun that they took the popcorn can lid home, and for the next couple of weeks, they would toss it whenever they had time after school or on weekends. Until it finally got all beat up and dented and sharp and dangerous. So at that point, Fred went into his mother's kitchen and borrowed a cake pan. And they found out that that actually flew a lot better than the popcorn can lid. Well, one day they happened to be out tossing it back and forth, and a fellow who had been watching walked up to them and said that he wanted to buy the cake pan for 25 cents. Fred says a light bulb went off at that point. He knew that he could get a new cake pan for 5 cents, and he said, if I can trade nickels for quarters, there's a business there. So from that point on, a new business popped up at all of the playgrounds where you could buy flying cake pans. Unfortunately, World War II happened, and Fred decided that it was his duty to go into the Army Air Corps, which he did. He flew P-47s, mostly over Italy, but he did learn a lot about what it took to make an airplane fly, and he learned a lot about aerodynamics, which came in handy for the next stage. After the war, he used the lessons he had learned about aerodynamics to design a brand new flying disc, which he called the Whirlaway after a famous racehorse in the early 40s. One of the things that they did was they explored the new material called plastic, which had been developed during World War II. And they decided that was much better and much safer and much cheaper to use than metal was. One of the things that they wanted to do with this new disc was come up with a catchy name. Whirlaway was unfamiliar to a lot of people, and something special had occurred in 1947. UFOs had been discovered, which a reporter called flying saucers. So they had a flying saucer. They decided best thing to do was to take advantage of the furor over UFOs. After 2 or 3 unproductive years, they decided that things just weren't working out, and Fred sat down and designed a brand new disc and called it the Pluto platter. For the next couple of years, he and his wife and their friends used to go out to parks and playgrounds and fairs and sell them just as he had sold his original flying saucer disc. One day, a representative from the Whammo Manufacturing Company happened to notice the activity around Fred selling his Pluto platters, and they decided, well, maybe that was a good product for them to have.
This is a pretty standard contract where they'll be manufacturing the Pluto platter.
Fred went to the Whammo company, and they sat down and hashed out a contract which allowed Whammo to take over complete marketing rights, manufacturing rights, everything to control the Pluto platter. Meanwhile, Fred wasn't the only one growing up that had been throwing things. One of the stories that many people know is that students at Yale would throw pie tins from the Frisbee Pie Company.
Everyone loves a great slice of pie and a good story, and the Frisbee delivers on both. As president and CEO of the Frisbee Pie Company, I'm often asked what and where is the correlation between Frisbee the toy and Frisbee the Pie Company. Around 1957, an article came out in Sports Illustrated referencing the Yale students on campus playing a game using the Frisbee pie tins. And the students throwing the tins were yelling Frisbee to not only let their teammate know that the Frisbee was on its way, but also in the event that a passerby might be aware that the Frisbee was coming in. So it really was a phrase that stuck, and it was very difficult to say I'm going out to play Pluto platter versus going out and saying, let's toss the Frisbee. The name Frisbee was so catchy that the Whammo team felt that that would be a great opportunity to rebrand and rename the Pluto platter to the Frisbee. The Frisbee Pie Company was founded in 1871 by William Russell Frisbee. And the spelling, I-E, is from the family name, while the toy, or the Frisbee that we know today, is spelt with E-E. As history has shown, the name, again, is directly associated to the Frisbee Pie Company in Bridgeport, Connecticut.
Here comes the Frisbee family of flying fun. Now, 7 different Frisbees, 7 ways to discover the wonderful world of Frisbee flight. Frisbee, everybody's idea of a good time. Frisbee and hula hoop, sold separately from Whammo.
In 1964, Whammo decided to hire a new marketing man named Ed Hedrick, and his first job was to see if he could prop up sales. Well, he took one look and decided he was going to change the image of it. So for their next batch of Frisbees, he added a little more weight to the rim to make it more stable, added some ribs for better control, added a sexy racing stripe to it, and changed the name to the Pro Model Frisbee. Now, at that point, the Frisbee went from the playground to the arena. During this time period, Whammo and Fred put a lot of effort into promoting the Frisbee, both as a competitive disc and also to the general public.
The Frisbee has evolved into one of the fastest growing, most popular sports, not only in the United States, but in the international arena, which includes disc golf as well as ultimate Frisbee, played throughout the world and is under review to be included in an upcoming Olympic event. And the influence in Fred Morrison, the Whammo team, and all the great activity that evolves to bring the Frisbee and what it's meant on a worldwide audience is just phenomenal.
And that's why it's become known worldwide. After all, who doesn't know what to do with a Frisbee?
Red light, green light. It's more than just a children's game. It's a matter of life and death. In the early 20th century, Salt Lake City, like other major metropolitan areas, was experiencing an explosion of growth and problems with traffic. Trolley cars, pedestrians, bicycles, automobiles, horse and buggies were all competing for space on the same streets. Into this chaotic mix of assorted vehicles stepped one man, with an idea that revolutionized the way we navigate city streets, not only in Salt Lake City, but around the world.
In 1909, Lester Farnsworth Wire graduated from Salt Lake High School. And while he was there, he was active in football. He started the girls and boys basketball teams, and he was also a sharpshooter. And he won many awards for that. After his graduation, he was appointed to West Point, but because of circumstances beyond his control, he was unable to go. And so then he decided to go to the University of Utah Law School. And he went there for about a semester, and he didn't have enough money to continue on. So in 1910, he was hired by the Salt Lake City Police Department. His first job was walking the beat, which he did for a couple of years. And then in 1912, B.F. Grant was hired as the police chief. And as part of reorganizing the police, he created a traffic department, and he put Lester in charge of it. One of the first things Lester did was he placed a patrolman at the intersection of 2nd South and Main Street in Salt Lake City, which was the busiest intersection in town. But Lester thought that the conditions on the street were unsafe, which they definitely were.
But to be cast out and to be trodden.
Lester and his sister Edith lived together, and both were quite religious. They read the Bible every day, and his sister was reading where it said, "Let your light so shine before men."
Let your light so shine before men, that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven. Think not that I am come to destroy the law.
Wait, could you read that passage again?
Ye are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hid. Neither do men light a candle and put it under a bushel, but on a candlestick. And it giveth light unto all that are in the house.
And that's where Lester got the idea for a light that people could see and recognize as a signal to go or stop. So he went to Consolidated Wagon, and he asked them to make him a box, 20 by 20 inches, 18 and a half inches high, with a pitch roof to keep the weather off of it, and then 2 round holes on each side.
Looks good. All right.
He then went down to the Union Pacific Railroad, their workshop, and asked them if they would electrify it, which they did. And it had a 2-way switch on it that operated the lights. At that time, there weren't any colored lights, and so he just took regular bulbs and he dipped them in paint, red and green. And the traffic policeman had to stand at the base of the light and switch it on and off for the cars. In 1914, Lester got another idea of putting a little platform on the corners, and it had an awning on it. And the policeman sat on that, and then he would just regulate the light from there. And that was safer for the policeman because he was out of the traffic, and he was somewhat protected from the weather. People who saw it made fun of it. They called it Wire's Birdhouse or Wire's Pigeon House.
I saw a pigeon fly out of your birdhouse. Change the light.
All right, all right.
(1916) was the biggest year for Lester. He was promoted to traffic sergeant, and he started coming up with the regulations. There were ordinances for the cars. He also had ordinances for pedestrians. He had one against what he called juvenile chauffeurs. And these were kids under 16 who were driving their parents' car, that was unsafe.
He made me do it.
And so he wanted to get the 15 and younger drivers off the road. The First World War changed everything for Lester. He was approached to start an ambulance corps. And in just a short time, he was able to recruit 100 men from the Salt Lake area to join the unit and go to France for the war. After Lester returned from World War I, one of the things that he tried to do was get a patent for his stoplight. But someone else had already taken one out in Cleveland. He worked with several attorneys, and it just didn't happen. So he never really received money for inventing the stoplight, but he was eventually promoted to detective and served in that job until his retirement. Lester Wire was a very significant person in the history of transportation and also in the history of Utah. He made one of the most significant contributions to our safety today, not only to people in Utah, but in the world, with his invention of the first stoplight.
The legacy of Lester Wire continues here at the UDOT Traffic Operations Center, where advanced technology is used to oversee the flow of vehicles throughout the state. Utah is setting the standard nationwide for monitoring complications such as accidents, increased cars attending concerts or ball games, and weather conditions, and then taking appropriate action to reroute traffic, all of which helps us to be as safe as possible on the streets, roads, and highways of our state. Zion's Cooperative Mercantile Institution, ZCMI. Not the catchiest name for a store, but certainly one of the most original. While other establishments such as R.H. Macy's and Bloomingdale's predate ZCMI, they began by selling only men's or women's apparel, and gradually over several decades added more and more accessories, household merchandise, and specialty items. But ZCMI, from its very beginning, handled a wide variety of consumer goods, making it America's first, and for quite a while, only department store.
When you first enter a big department store, I think one of the strongest impressions you get is of the scope of the space. You're overwhelmed by immense possibilities. You have so many different things that you can choose to buy or explore. And that's not at all how it was for ZCMI at the beginning. A better way of imagining the origins of ZCMI is to look at a frontier picture of Main Street and to see all of the individual businesses that together combine to form ZCMI as a company. Many of these buildings were single-story, gabled roof buildings that had the symbol, Holiness to the Lord, and the all-seeing eye as sort of the logo of ZCMI. Brigham Young was a huge proponent of home manufacturing and self-sufficiency. And when he gathered a group of businessmen in the late 1860s, they talked about ways to join forces, to bring together the businesses that they had all begun, and many of which were very successful, in a single entity. And they came up with the idea of ZCMI, or a cooperative that brought together the inventories of their individual businesses into a single whole. But they also received stock in the company for doing that. And so you have this really interesting mix of businesses, and it might be anything from a store that sold hats next to a store that sold stoves, and next to that, a manufacturer of clocks, to a traditional dry goods store or a meat market. But together they created this departmental organization from the first. For many years, ZCMI was located in a variety of different buildings on Main Street. One of those original buildings that still remains is the Eagle Emporium, and it was a sturdy, neoclassical stone building on First South and Main Street. In fact, the mother store of ZCMI was always located on Main Street. But in 1876, they built one main location.
Even though the new store was of masonry construction, Brigham Young was eager to show that Salt Lake City was no longer a frontier town and was just as modern and sophisticated as any metropolitan area in the country. With that thought, he ordered the facade of the edifice to reflect the latest construction method of the day, the use of cast iron.
Cast iron buildings were a design innovation of the 1850s and 1860s, and this was an interesting innovation, high-tech innovation of that age. Now, what was interesting as these facades were built, the components were simply ordered from a catalog. You could order columns and Corinthian column capitals and all kinds of embellishments, pick those pieces out of a catalog and mix and match them however you wanted to. And as ZCMIs was built in sections, it was easy just to order more of these components and expand as the building increased in size.
An 1888 addition doubled the size of the store, and another add-on in 1901 completed ZCMI's frontage along Main Street.
ZCMI started to venture into manufacturing as well. One of the early ventures was manufacturing shoes and other leather products. And a second one was going into clothing manufacturing. The range was from work clothes to pajamas, and in one instance it was described as a negligee, which is kind of hard to imagine in the 1800s. ZCMI always had a tradition of staging events that would draw crowds of people, and it might be that they decorated the entire facade with flags. They would also invite musicians or authors. They would invite famous personalities to come and either speak or do some music or something to draw crowds of people there. The most famous tradition of ZCMI probably was decorating the windows at Christmas time, and I can remember many times bringing my family down there. Every year it was more outrageous and beautiful and magical, and that kind of tradition has historically been part of that company's institutional approach.
Throughout the years, branch locations were opened in Ogden, Logan, and the Cottonwood area. And additional stores continued to spring up in other urban areas, as well as neighboring states. But the main store in the heart of Salt Lake City was beginning to show her age, and talk began about reconceptualizing ZCMI into a downtown shopping mall for a more modern era. However, the thought of demolishing the historic building that had become a staple on the Utah landscape didn't sit well with the public. Talk especially surrounded what was to become with the classic iron facade.
About the time that it was decided ZCMIs needed to be torn down and rebuilt as a new shopping complex, a cast iron building had never been restored before in the United States, and so it looked at the time that it would be easier just to throw the building away. But there was such an outcry from the historical preservationists, it convinced the powers that be that that facade needed to be saved and restored. Because of his background in restoration, my father, Stephen T. Baird, was hired to be the supervising architect for the restoration of the building. He very carefully disassembled components of that building and figured out how it had been built and how it could be totally disassembled, restored, and reassembled. And as the shopping complex was completed, this facade was reinstalled on the front of the building. It kept its beautiful appearance in sort of a reuse for our modern times. It was interesting that the ZCMI facade was the first building to actually be disassembled and restored as it originally was. Another Utah first. Now we travel throughout the world restoring and working on similar buildings.
With a new downtown shopping mall anchored by Utah's largest department store chain, the ZCMI Center helped revitalize the heart of Salt Lake City. But the latter part of the 20th century brought drastic and rapid transformations to the retail world, and Zion's Cooperative Mercantile Institution began to feel the cold reality of these winds of change.
ZCMI was always conscious of being up to date and modern. At the same time, it was an institution that was based on tradition and relatively conservative values. Because of changed markets, increased number of competitors, the leadership of the company started talking about decline in terms of success. So in 1999, ZCMI sold, which is kind of hard to imagine, and it was a very, very different scene. There was a lot of nostalgia in the community for America's first department store.
Although the store, ZCMI, was no longer in existence, the retail complex that bore its name still continued to welcome customers to downtown Salt Lake City. However, as a new century dawned, new ideas began to develop in an effort to keep up with the changing shopping preferences.
When the City Creek Center was built, our company was tasked with, again, supervising the restoration of that building to save the landmark, historical ZCMI facade. Our modern buildings are designed, it appears, to last about 30 years. And after 30 years, the ZCMI Mall had served its purpose, and it was time to tear that building down and build a brand new, entirely new complex. It was substantially easier this time to disassemble a ZCMI facade because we had the experience of our previous time 30 years ago, and the components were in much better shape. So it was taken down, stored in our warehouse, a new paint scheme was devised, and the building was reassembled as it was installed on this new City Creek complex. I love to walk down Main Street today and see the old historical facade of the ZCMI store there. It holds great memories for me from my youth to the time of my life when I was involved in dismantling that building, renovating and restoring pieces and components of it, until this final restoration, the most beautiful presentation of the ZCMI facade in its entire history.
The medallions on either side of the pediment atop the ZCMI building refer to important dates in the store's history. Originally, it was 1868 and 1901, referring to the co-op's founding and the completion of the store on Main Street. When the facade was restored in the 1970s, the 1901 date was changed to 1976 to reflect the opening of the ZCMI Center. Since the completion of the City Creek Center, the refurbished facade has displayed the dates 1868 and 1999, commemorating all the years in which ZCMI was in operation. Although ZCMI has now been absorbed into the Macy's retail chain, the beautifully restored facade stands on Main Street as a historic reminder of Utah's leading shopping establishment and the United States' original department store. When you think of the final frontier of space, Utah may not even enter your mind. However, the Beehive State does have a connection to a space flight first. Throughout the 1960s, the United States manned spaceflight program was limited to small capsules that could only carry 1 to 2 astronauts. Even the Apollo spacecraft was sent into the moon could only carry 3 people. But in the early 1980s, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, developed a reusable spaceship, the Shuttle, which could carry as many as 8 people into Earth's orbit. The larger crew complement allowed doctors, scientists, and engineers to now travel beyond the confines of the Earth and perform tasks impossible to carry out anywhere else. By the mid-1980s, NASA officials decided it was time for a member of Congress to travel into space, someone responsible for evaluating NASA's needs and budget, and who could be an advocate for the space program. That honor fell to the head of the powerful Senate Subcommittee on Appropriations, Utah's Senator Edwin Jacob Garn, better known as Jake. Although the decision raised some eyebrows, Senator Garn was ideally suited to travel as a payload specialist aboard the shuttle.
A lot of people don't understand that beyond being a senator, I had been a Navy pilot on active duty for 4 years. Came home, there's no Naval Air Reserve in Salt Lake, and transferred to the Utah Air Guard and spent 20 years in the Air Force. So I had almost 25 years as a military pilot, so I was qualified.
But the national news didn't want to print my background because that ruined their story about this Utah senator.
Forcing his way onto the space shuttle. Back to the time I flew, I had more pilot time than any astronaut who had ever flown. So anything that they did or asked me to do, I had done over and over again for a long period of time. So it was like a college graduate going back to kindergarten.
And one of the things NASA required of the senator, as with all astronauts, was to begin an intensive training program to evaluate his physical, mental, and emotional state, to determine his ability to handle the rigors of space travel, and to assure he could work in harmony with other members of the crew. One test involved taking a ride on a special plane with a very unusual name.
Well, the vomit comet, they go up and they do like this, and so you're weightless at the top of that orbit. You just float around the cabin.
After passing all of his pre-flight test and training, Jake Garn was assigned to shuttle mission STS-51D, and in April 1985 became the first elected official to travel in space.
I flew on a Space Shuttle Discovery. I thought that was a very appropriate one to fly on. Discovery? You go into space?
Main engine start, 7, 6, and we have main engine start, 4, 3, 2, 1. We have SRB ignition and liftoff. Liftoff of mission 51.
You're laying on your back, so the G-forces are transverse, so it doesn't drain the blood out of your head or so on, but for about 8 minutes, it's really pressing you back into your seat. But what's most dramatic, after 8.5 minutes of being shot into space on those rockets, suddenly you're in microgravity. And so that instant change in just a minute is amazing.
Once the crew of Discovery commenced orbiting the Earth, they also began the assignments they had been given. And for astronaut Jake, that included research into a problem that had plagued explorers since the beginning of manned spaceflight, that of motion sickness in zero gravity.
Well, as you can see, we're having lots of fun up here trying to figure out what happens to the human body in zero G. I've been doing a number of space motion sickness studies, and Dr. Ray Seton is now looking at my heart with ultrasound. So we're hopeful that all of these electrodes and wires coming out of me will provide a few pieces of the puzzle for space motion sickness.
They call it the Garn scale of space sickness, which irritated me in a way, because old military pilot of 25 years, I don't get air sick. I was supposed to. I was all wired up. I had electrocardiograms on my heart, on my head, back of my neck, wrists, and so on. And so they were monitoring all the body fluid shifts, blood changes, and all of that. So I was literally the first human guinea pig in space.
More pleasurable undertakings involved launching a satellite and demonstrating to school children how toys worked in the weightlessness of outer space. But the most memorable times Senator Garn experienced on his stellar voyage were the times he could view the wonders of the Earth.
Well, I'll never forget the first time I got out of my seat. I was down on the mid-deck, so you couldn't see outside, so I floated up to the flight deck and looked out. And it was just so amazing to think that little Jake Garn from Ridgefield, Utah, was above the Earth 300 miles, traveling at 25 times the speed of sound, and see the beauty of this planet.
But it also is a life-changing experience. Flying in space recognizes that we are all children of God traveling on Spaceship Earth together, and we ought to treat each other a lot better than we do.
I still marvel, even after all these years, that I had that incredible opportunity.
Today, Jake Garn continues to advocate for the space program, reminding people that the private sector earns $8 or $9 in residual spinoffs for every tax dollar spent on NASA. Senator Garn retired from Congress in 1993, and he and his wife Kathleen live a more quiet life at their home in Salt Lake City, surrounded by family. Always the adventurer, he's ready to make another trip into space whenever he's asked. By the middle of the 19th century, the call of manifest destiny, or the idea that Americans would inhabit all of the lands between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, was on the lips of everyone. And this wasn't just boastful talk. People were making good on this notion with their actions. Aided by the opening of the Oregon Territory for settlement, the migration of the Mormon pioneers, and the California gold rush, Americans were rapidly establishing communities along the Pacific coast and in the Great Basin. With this vast influx of Americans and more arriving each year, a better method of communication was needed to stay in touch with family and friends in the East. Normally, it would take months for a letter to travel from St. Louis, Missouri to, say, San Francisco, California. But enterprising individuals thought of a way to cut that time drastically with the birth of the Pony Express, the nation's first regular trans-Western mail service. Wanted: young, skinny, wiry fellows, not over 18, must be expert riders, willing to risk death daily. Orphans preferred.
Relay stations, like this one in Utah's West Desert, enabled some 80 riders to change their tired horses for fresh ones as they carried mail across the frontier. But with the beginning of the war between the states, the need for lightning-fast communication became imperative. While telegraph lines crisscrossed the eastern United States and were even making inroads around California, there was no way to send a telegram all the way across the continent. And that's where Utah comes into play. President Lincoln and others doubted that a transcontinental telegraph line could be built because of the lack of trees for the poles across the vast grassy plains of Nebraska, the rocky terrain of Wyoming, the salt flats of Utah, and the deserts of Nevada. However, Brigham Young and leaders of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints were anxious to help in any way possible. With their extensive network of outposts and a constant stream of wagon trains going east and west, the Latter-day Saints began hauling poles, and many Mormon laborers helped string wire along the 1,500 miles from Omaha, Nebraska to Carson City, Nevada, through some of the most barren and inhospitable parts of North America. By October 1861, the lines from the eastern states and from California converged in Salt Lake City, much to the delight of territorial, city, and church officials.
The East and the West are now connected!
An important part of Brigham Young's character was his love of technology, and he took an active interest in the telegraph, sending the first message east to a nation embroiled in civil war.
The Honorable J.H. Wade, President of the Pacific Telegraph Company, Cleveland, Ohio. There's her.
President Young's communication was relayed across country from one telegraph office to another until it reached its final destination, after which the reply was sent back to Salt Lake City, the entire process taking only a few hours.
Brother Vickers?
Oh. Honorable Brigham Young, President, Great Salt Lake City. Sir, I have the honor to acknowledge the receipt of your message, which was in every way gratifying. Not only in the announcement of the completion of the Pacific Telegraph, but that yours, the first message to pass over the line, should express so unmistakably sentiments of yourself and people. I am your obedient servant, J.H. Wade.
Oh, wonderful. Oh. What a remarkable way to communicate.
Later, President Young sent the first telegraph message west to California.
Well, how will this do? The Honorable H.W. Carpenter, President of the Oberlin Telegraph Company. Dear sir, I'm very much obliged for your kindness in giving me the privilege of being the first message to California. May success ever attend your enterprise. Your friend, Brigham Young. Huh? All right. Here, Brother Collins, you send that to them, please.
With the birth of the transcontinental telegraph came the death of the Pony Express. As they closed their doors and pastured their horses after only a year and a half in operation, the company had fallen prey to the almost instantaneous communication now available from coast to coast. But the first transcontinental telegraph line wasn't the end of Brigham Young's fascination with this electric wonder.
We have witnessed this day, a marvel of the age. And may I say, I want a company raised to stretch a wire into all the communities throughout the territory, that information can be communicated
to all parts with lightning speed.
All right, you fine young man.
So Brigham set out to create the first church-owned public utility, the Deseret Telegraph Company. While the poles were being set and the wire strung, an appeal was made for teenage boys to travel to Salt Lake City and attend telegraphy classes. But it wasn't just boys who were developing skills in the new technology. Because many small-town telegraph offices were located in homes, young women were also encouraged to apply. The thinking was that while they were doing work around the house, they would have time to provide a fundamental service for their communities. As one young lady recalled,
"We girls had a happy, busy time and enjoyed our study and practice of telegraphy. We kept in touch with each other by making use of the privilege of chatting over the line after business hours."
now that Eastern and Western America had been connected by wire, the push was made to link the country by rail. In many ways, building the Transcontinental Railroad paralleled the construction of the Transcontinental Telegraph. Both technologies had been well established in the East and had taken a foothold in California. But it was the large swath of the nation between the Missouri River and the Sierra Nevada mountains that needed to be crossed. And as difficult as it was to build a telegraph from coast to coast, that was nothing compared to constructing a ribbon of steel across the country.
For more than a decade, government agents had been mapping routes for a transcontinental railroad. Ironically, while the country was in the process of breaking apart due to the Civil War, Congress passed the Railroad Act of 1862, making possible the uniting of the country by rail. The two companies with the major responsibility for building this steel highway were the Central Pacific from California and the Union Pacific heading westward. But as construction began, each company found they had their own set of problems to contend with.
The Central Pacific encountered its first obstacle about 40 miles east of Sacramento, and this was the Sierra Nevada mountains. These are solid granite mountains, epic winters, extreme hardship, and this would challenge them and probably make them one of the better engineers in the race from the get-go. Conversely, the Union Pacific had to deal with a shortage of materials in that in Nebraska there aren't forests. So they had to import all of their railroad ties. And for the most part, until they really got started with their laying of the rail, besides just building grade, most of their stuff had to be brought in as well. So both companies dealt with supply chain issues that we couldn't even imagine today. When you look at the Central Pacific and their labor issue that they had to deal with, they decided to experiment with Chinese workers, and the experiment turned out to be a success in more ways than we could ever imagine. It was remarkable because people thought, well, they don't look burly enough to do this backbreaking work, and they surprised everybody. Eventually, they contracted with China to bring workers over. And their labor force mushroomed from a couple hundred to 5,000 to over 11,000 Chinese workers at one point during the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. These workers, many of them stayed with the Central Pacific Railroad after the completion of the Transcontinental route, and they helped maintain the railroad. And some of those camps are here around Promontory. There was one down near the base of the Promontory Mountains, and it's near what we now call Chinese Arch. For us, the arch is a tribute to the Chinese workers and to their labor and to their ingenuity and their perseverance. They got the job done, and it's remarkable.
For 7 years, the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific worked toward each other and toward their common goal. However, the question remained, where would the two rail lines meet? By direction of Congress, it was decided that the convergence would take place in a small valley in the Promontory Mountains north of the Great Salt Lake. With that pronouncement, the race was on to Utah.
The decision to make Promontory the meeting point was decided in late April of 1869. So now the Union Pacific had a clear target, and so did the Central Pacific. Finally, May 10th, 1869 came, and it was sunny but chilly. And the railroad companies came in their special cars, with their locomotives, the Jupiter coming from the west, which is representing the Central Pacific, and the 119 representing the Union Pacific coming from the east. And then it was time for the construction superintendents to let their workers lay the last rail and the last ties. The ceremony involved presenting 2 gold spikes to Dr. Durant and to Leland Stanford from the Central Pacific Railroad and the Union Pacific Railroad. And for the first time in this continent's history, we were united by rail, by a road. And when you're up here in this valley, it's a subtle and humble place. It's mostly grass with a few sage and juniper, and it doesn't look like a place where something so momentous would happen. But as you start to think about what transpired here at Promontory, you realize that this humble location was truly transformative for this country. And something like that doesn't happen very often. On May 10th of 1869, when the Transcontinental Railroad was completed, there was no doubt that we were going to be a United States of America.
America took a giant leap forward in the fields of communication and transportation with the building of the Transcontinental Telegraph and Railroad. Both were remarkable feats of technology, engineering, and innovation that could not have happened without the help and support of the local people. Both were firsts of their kind, and both of these dreams were realized right here in Utah. Sometimes it appears that greatness comes from an opportunity seemingly handed to us on a silver platter. But in reality, it's the years of hard work that have prepared us to accomplish those incredible tasks and achieve that greatness. And on rare occasions, thrust us into the history books. That's exactly what happened to Betty Miller, who in the spring of 1963 gained worldwide recognition for her adventurous journey.
What is your name, please?
My name is Betty Miller.
My name is Betty Miller.
My name is Betty Miller.
One of my fondest memories of my Aunt Betty is when I was a child, and we would wait on the front porch, my brother and I, for her to come pick us up in her little blue car. And she would take us for a drive, and we would go to the airport and watch the airplanes take off. Betty wanted to be a stewardess. She applied and was so excited about it, but she was too short, so they didn't take her. So she got a job with the FAA in Los Angeles. She worked in the tower, and she worked there for quite a while. And then there was a job open in Wendover, in Utah. When Betty was in Wendover, Chuck Miller was flying airplanes. And he came to the tower several times, and that started the beginning of a love story that just never ended. Chuck taught her to fly. And once she got in the air, she never wanted to come down. They were wonderful. They had a good life and lived in Wendover for quite a while.
After their stint at the Wendover Air Base, Betty and Chuck moved to California and started giving flying lessons at their school, the Santa Monica Flyers. Located close to Hollywood, many actors came to the school in order to learn the principles of aircraft operations, especially when their roles in television programs or motion pictures required them to convincingly portray the role of an aviator.
Betty and Chuck knew several people who had a lot of influence in aircraft, and Max Conrad of Piper Aircraft was one of them. And he came to their school and wanted them to deliver some planes to other countries. So they thought about it, and they thought it was a pretty good idea, and he wanted them to deliver one to Australia. And so she thought about it, and they researched it and realized that if she did that, she would be the first woman to fly across the Pacific Ocean solo.
I, Betty Miller, am a licensed airplane pilot. Last month, I had the thrill of a lifetime. I flew a small twin-engined airplane from California to Australia. I am the first and only woman to fly solo across the entire Pacific Ocean.
Betty's journey across the Pacific Ocean would mimic Amelia Earhart's route, only in reverse, from Oakland, California to Australia. Her Piper Apache airplane was modified for the long flight by removing the back seat and replacing it with extra fuel tanks. When engine trouble developed, she made an unscheduled landing and was forced to act as her own mechanic. And when her plane was struck by lightning, she continued onward, undaunted by the treacherous weather. Finally, on May 13th, 1963, she landed safely in Brisbane, Australia, to the cheers of thousands.
And it was a wonderful experience. And before she left, she said, "Sherry, you know those red pants that you have that you wear to football games?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Can I borrow them?" She will not fly in slacks. She always wears a dress. And when she got on that flight, she had a dress. But after she got in the air, she slipped the pants on because it gets cold up in the air and there was no heater. So it kept her warm. And Betty was the first one to fly solo across the Pacific. But the word solo is kind of in doubt. She did have a co-pilot. She had a little troll doll. And Betty was a very proper woman. She didn't swear. But she named the doll Damn It. And she said when she got upset with flying or got into something that she was a little concerned about, she would just look at it and say, "Oh, damn it." And that took care of everything for her. And she loved that little doll. And she took it everywhere with her.
And one place Betty took Damn It was to the White House, when President John F. Kennedy awarded her the Federal Aviation Administration's Gold Medal for Exceptional Service. The following year, President Lyndon B. Johnson bestowed upon Betty the Harmon Aviatrix Award for being the first woman to fly solo across the Pacific. In the intervening years, Betty and Chuck traveled around the world, delivering airplanes, helping NASA develop the physical requirements for female astronauts, as well as participating in their first love, teaching others to fly.
Let's go right now to the moment of truth and learn which one of these ladies actually did that amazing flight. So will the real Betty Miller please stand up? Our congratulations to you, young lady.
Thank you.
I'll bet your husband's nails were pretty well chewed down to the quick when he finally got the all clear that you'd landed safe and sound.
He held up pretty well.
I'm glad he did.
Uncle Chuck passed away in 1998, and Betty came to Utah because this is where her flying started, and she loved it. So she came back here, and she's going to live her life out here.
Now past 90 years old, Betty Miller no longer flies and is living out her retirement at her home in Bountiful, Utah. But although her feet are firmly planted on the ground, her heart and dreams are still in the sky.
Betty left a legacy to all women. If you have an idea that you want to do something, don't put it away because somebody says you can't. Go for it. Go find your dreams and make them work. And when you find your dream and you start to follow it, you may find that you're the first one that has ever done it, just like my Aunt Betty.
Thank you. The dining out habits of Americans have changed quite a bit over the decades. If you were to step back in time about 70 years, you would find no chain restaurants scattered across the country and the idea of fast food pretty much non-existent. But shortly after World War II, the idea of franchised eateries started to take hold. The concept of a franchise was that local business people could buy a territory, such as Utah, and open an eating establishment that would be part of a family with nationwide exposure. For a fee, these small businesses would have the expertise of that main office that had solved many problems and established a successful business model. They also received help with menus, products, packaging, recipes, quality control, as well as marketing and advertising. In the early 1950s, two restaurateurs, Colonel Harlan Sanders from Kentucky and Leon Pete Harmon from Utah, attended a convention in Chicago, and unbeknownst to them, began laying the foundation of a great American institution as they spent hours talking about their respective restaurants.
Now, there were two things that really came out of that conversation. One is the Colonel had a neat recipe for his fried chicken. Two, Pete brought up that he had a restaurant in Salt Lake City and talked a little about his business, and he told the Colonel that he did $1,000 on a Saturday. The Colonel was blown away by that. This is 1952. $1,000 on a Saturday is a whole lot of money. Both of them were pretty impressed with the other's ace in the hole. Bottom line of that was, at the end of the week, they said, well, hey, we'll have to get together and follow up on this. And they both said, yeah, let's do that. And off they went. Oftentimes those things happen, but this particular time the colonel was headed to the West Coast. He called ahead to Pete and said, I'm going to be in town, I'd love to see your place. Pete said, well, gosh, come on in, we'll get you taken care of. Now, Pete planned on doing what Pete would call a $2 tour with him, where you take him to Kennecott Copper Mine, walk him through Temple Square and up to a ski resort, and then he was going to take him out to dinner and buy him a good steak. The colonel said, oh, I don't need a steak. Let me cook this chicken for you.
Years ago when I had my own restaurant, most popular item on the menu was fried chicken. It was much better than the usual southern fried chicken that most folks were used to. Good chicken coated with the milk and egg dip, breaded with my secret recipe of 11 herbs and spices, then cooked in the all-vegetable shortening while I make sure that the pressure, temperature, and time are just right. Folks that came to my place to eat loved it because I always did cook good chicken, don't you see?
When he served it to Pete and Arlene, they were really impressed. Pete looked at his wife and she had a gleam in her eye that just said, wow. And he told the colonel, this is amazing stuff. You've got a good one here. It's a winner. And the colonel says, well, if you like it, here you go. And he dug the recipe out of his pocket and he handed it to Pete. He says, there you go. Give it a whirl. And Pete says, well, I can't just take your recipe. The colonel says, sure you can. It's my recipe. I can do what I want with it. And Pete says, well, I've got to pay you for it. Why don't I pay you a nickel a chicken? And the colonel said, if you feel good about that, let's do it. And they shook hands, and Pete was really impressed with this product, this recipe for fried chicken, and he called his window painter, Don Anderson, to come down and paint it up on the windows. They had 40 feet of windows out on State Street there. And Don came down, and he said, what do you want up here? And Pete said, well, fried chicken. And Don says, fried chicken? It's got to have a little more ring to it than that. Tell me about this. He says, well, I have a friend from Kentucky. His name's Harlan Sanders. And he was out and he showed me how to cook this stuff, and we really like it. And he said I could feature it on my menu. So we want to get it rolling. And I thought fried chicken sounded fine. But if he's from Kentucky, let's call it Kentucky Fried Chicken. About 2 weeks after the colonel had met with Pete and Arlene in Salt Lake City, he was coming back through on his way from the West Coast. And as he pulled up the stoplight there in front of the restaurant on 39th and State, he noticed the front windows were all painted Kentucky Fried Chicken dinner. He was quite pleased with what he saw going on there. And he and Pete talked a little about it, and everything was going well, and he headed on back home. Now, over the course of the next 18 months, that product just went wild. Pete called the colonel and says, you better get this patented and registered before somebody steals it from you. The colonel says, okay, I'll get on that. But he didn't. Pete became concerned, so he had his attorney draw up the papers to get the product patented and registered for the colonel to make sure that nobody else did it and took advantage of him. And that's how the Kentucky Fried Chicken franchise got started. As things got rolling, Harmon's Cafe on 39th and State became a very busy restaurant. And the colonel had gone out on the road to sell the idea of adding his Kentucky Fried Chicken to restaurants' menus. He got out there talking to a group of potential franchisees, and if he was impressed with them and they were intrigued, he would fly them to Salt Lake City to what he called the world's first Kentucky Fried Chicken franchise and let them walk in there. And there's chicken on virtually every table. That was his sales pitch. They'd end up buying the franchise and adding it to the restaurant. For the first few years, that was the game plan. Add it to an existing restaurant that does a great job with customer service, good products, and clean.
Most people are under the impression that Colonel Sanders had some type of military background. And while he did serve in the Army, the designation colonel is a symbolic one. The title of Kentucky Colonel is the highest honor bestowed by the governor of that state on a person for their charitable giving and outstanding service. And Harlan Sanders took this recognition to heart by dressing the part with a long coat and distinctive Kentucky Colonel tie. But his signature white suit was the idea of Pete Harmon, who had one tailor-made for him to combat the heat at a Days of 47 parade in Salt Lake City. Colonel Harlan Sanders and Pete Harmon were kindred spirits. They were both kind-hearted, caring individuals. Both were philanthropists and believed in giving back and helping others. One was known for his great chicken recipe, the other for his business savvy, and they worked together to bring the Kentucky Fried Chicken empire to every corner of the world, with more than 10,000 locations. And that first franchise store began right here, on the corner of 39th South and State Street in Salt Lake City. In any field of endeavor, there is a word we use for those who see the world with insight above and beyond what most of us can perceive. We call them visionaries. One such imaginative thinker was a Utah-born farm boy, a largely self-taught individual who made possible the technology from which an entire industry sprang. His name? Philo Taylor Farnsworth. His invention? Television. Philo T. Farnsworth was born in a log cabin at Indian Creek, a small community near Beaver, Utah. When he was 6 years old, he saw his first telephone and thought he was seeing a magic trick. The ability to hear a voice over a long distance was a wonder to the young boy. His father explained that the telephone was not magic, but rather an invention, a device created by a man. From that moment on, Philo decided he wanted to be an inventor and set out to pursue a career as an architect of electronic wonders. When their Utah farm failed, the Farnsworth family moved to Rigby, Idaho, where there was a promise of a better life due to the thriving sugar beet industry. The new farm was a place of great excitement because it was the first time the family enjoyed the convenience of electricity. But a chance discovery proved to be the greatest education Philo Farnsworth could dream of. In the attic of the farmhouse, he found a stack of old science magazines, which he read over and over. These magazines inspired his imagination as he envisioned the electronic wonders that he read about. In time, he began to think of ways to improve already existing technologies. One of his early inventions won him a $25 prize at the science fair. As he gained success and notoriety, Philo found out the hard way that there were greedy people ready to take advantage of him. One instance came about after he applied for a patent for his invention of a fine tuner on a radio. He sent a lawyer $200 he had borrowed from his father. Months later, Philo received a letter from the attorney saying there was already a similar patent and his had been rejected. However, he later read an article with drawings very close to the ones he had previously submitted. The young inventor felt cheated. As Philo continued to study, he began to understand the workings of radio broadcast and the concept of sending pictures through the airwaves by means of a mechanical television. The theory behind mechanical television was that by spinning a disc punctured with small holes designed to capture patterns of light, an image could be converted to electrical impulses and transmitted to another spinning disc in an exact representation. He concluded the disc would never be able to spin fast enough to transmit clear, detailed images, but he thought electrons could do the job. Living on a farm required hard physical labor. Fortunately, while his hands were busy, his mind was free to think about the ideas gained from his readings. Ultimately, his farm work, combined with his ponderings, inspired young Farnsworth's ideas for electronic television, the process of scanning an image by means of electrons. While working in the field one day, he noticed the straight lines made by the farm equipment in the soil. With his inventive mind, he grasped the concept of how electronic television could work by creating row after row of pinpoints of light to create an image. The next fall, 14-year-old Farnsworth attended Rigby High School, where he met one of his greatest mentors. Justin Tolman was the chemistry teacher for a senior grade course, and Philo, a freshman, made every effort to attend his lectures. One day, he met in private with Tolman and began drawing a diagram to explain his ideas about television. The science teacher could hardly believe what he was seeing and could think of no reason why the device wouldn't work. Years later, Tolman reflected on the experience. Looking back, he said, I realized nearly every question he asked me had some bearing on the problems of television. I see now that it was all coming together in that head of his. Philo's studies in Rigby, Idaho continued until the family once again found themselves in financial difficulties. In the summer of 1922, the Farnsworths moved to Provo, Utah, where the young man had the opportunity to attend Brigham Young University. But his college career was short-lived. Faced with the death of his father, Philo was unable to keep up with the needs of his family, much less his own schooling. He decided to discontinue his formal education and seek employment. Farnsworth arranged to move to California to continue his television research where resources and potential investors were more promising. Each day, the 21-year-old inventor drew closer to his goal. Philo was working on the image dissector tube, the device that would become the central component of electronic television. The tube could pick up an image, translate it into electrons, and reconvert it into that exact same image on a receiving screen. Finally, on September 7, 1927, after months of work, the first all-electronic television image was transmitted. A glass plate with a horizontal image etched onto it was placed in front of the image dissector. As Farnsworth adjusted the knobs on the set, the picture came into focus. The horizontal line was then rotated 90 degrees to show movement. This ensured that an exact representation from the etched glass was being produced. Electronic television had been achieved, and over the next few months, refinements and advances came quickly. The US government awarded Philo a patent for his amazing invention, and with the success of the first television system, the inventor set out to attract more investors who could help him produce television for the masses. While drawing attention to his invention was important, the publicity would also bring competition. The media mogul of the day was David Sarnoff of RCA. He had hired Vladimir Zworykin, a promising engineer who was also experimenting with the development of electronic television. However, Zworykin was having difficulties with his system, and when he heard about the success Farnsworth was having, decided to pay a visit to the San Francisco laboratory. Not knowing the intentions of Zworykin, Farnsworth freely showed him around the facilities, explaining the workings of the image dissector tube, and the RCA inventor was astounded at what he saw. After 3 days visiting Farnsworth's labs, Zworykin sent a 700-word telegram back to his employers, explaining what he had observed. By the time he returned to New York, the engineers in the RCA lab had created something very similar to what Farnsworth had invented. The competition had now begun, and the challenge to Farnsworth's patents was underway. The battle for television supremacy began to rage as David Sarnoff and all the power of RCA challenged Philo Farnsworth's patents. The situation was truly a David and Goliath story, with the young inventor, still in his 20s, contending against one of America's giant companies. But Farnsworth had learned that there would always be others trying to steal his ideas, and he had some stones in his bag to combat just such obstacles. First, Farnsworth had kept very detailed notes of everything he had worked on in his labs, and these records would confirm undeniably dates, developments, and accomplishments. Second, Philo's lawyer, David Lippincott, had created an ironclad patent for the 1927 television system. But perhaps the greatest item in the arsenal was his high school science teacher, Justin Tolman. When Farnsworth's lawyer located him, Tolman had the evidence that put the nail in Sarnoff's coffin. He had kept the drawing that 14-year-old Philo had shown him in 1922. With that, the RCA lawyer knew the battle was lost. The courts ruled in favor of Farnsworth, requiring Sarnoff and RCA to pay licensing fees to someone else for the very first time. With the onset of the Second World War, all development of television stopped, as resources were turned toward the war effort. By the time World War II ended, Farnsworth's patents had expired, and his window for receiving financial rewards had passed, as now larger companies began producing television equipment. Farnsworth could not compete, and he walked away from the industry he helped create. In later life, Philo Farnsworth set up a lab at the University of Utah to work on various projects, including a process that he envisioned would provide a clean, reliable, unlimited source of power. He was thrilled by the advancements of the space program.
Like millions of others, he watched in amazement as the Apollo 11 astronauts landed on the moon.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
At that moment, Farnsworth was content, knowing that through all the failed attempts, legal battles, and heartaches of his life, his invention, television, was the means of uniting the world, if only for a brief moment, in the summer of 1969. The unique gift of Philo T. Farnsworth was his ability to view the ordinary and conceive the extraordinary. As a boy, he used his imagination to create the technical marvels of television. His contribution stands in league with great inventors whose lives were dedicated to improving the world in which they lived. Today, Philo T. Farnsworth is universally accepted as the father of television. That's quite an accomplishment for a Utah boy made good. I wish that I could say that in the realms of politics, Utah granted women the right to vote before any other state or territory in the nation, but I can't. That honor goes to Wyoming, which passed women's suffrage in 1869. Utah followed a few months later. But Utah is noted for a political first, an accomplishment that had never transpired anywhere else in America up until that time: the election of a female mayor and all-women town council. And it's a story that is still being told in the southern Utah community of Kanab.
Actually, the election of an all-woman town council in Kanab, Utah, over 100 years ago, started out as a prank. That's right, it was a joke. The local men of the community, as a joke, put the ladies' names on the ballot, thinking that they wouldn't go for it, but the joke was actually on them. On election day, the ladies were surprised to find that they were the only 5 candidates on the ballot. But they, like everyone else, went ahead and voted.
We are going to vote.
And they were elected. And they decided they would go ahead and do the very best job they could. The ladies were very accessible to the constituents in the community because, think of it, they had to walk wherever they wanted to go. There weren't automobiles at the time, so people, especially women, didn't mind stopping the women of the town council and asking them about certain issues that were troubling them. Mary Woolley Chamberlain was elected mayor, and actually she had served in one elected position before. She was elected county clerk in 1870. And so she had some experience in an elected position, and she could help coach the other ladies a little bit. Although they were pretty strong-willed themselves, they made a great team. Let me tell you a few of the things they accomplished. One of the biggest things that they had to contend with in the growing community of Kanab was animal control. If you can imagine animals running at will, pigs, goats, cows, you can just imagine what the roadways were like. So they initiated an ordinance that animals had to be controlled. And this was something that the men had long thought it should be done too, but they just didn't have the time to go about enforcing any kind of ordinance.
Some way to control all the cows.
One of the other things they did was to look at the Kanab City Cemetery. It had gone fallow, it was not landscaped, and actually there were graves dug and people buried, and nobody was recording who was buried where. Another one of the issues that the town council dealt with was young boys, especially with what they called flippers. We call them slingshots today. Now, it might sound like a trite thing, but the young boys were shooting birds out of the trees, and they were, I imagine, once in a while shooting the girls, too. So the ladies initiated an ordinance, and there was a fine for anybody that was caught shooting a flipper. They had to walk wherever they went, and at that time, the irrigation water would run along the ditches where we would think of curb and gutters today. And it was quite difficult if they were walking in their skirts, of course, and baby buggies, that type of thing. It was quite a nuisance, especially to the ladies. I think the children probably enjoyed splashing around in the water a little bit. But they had the men build wooden culverts so they could cross at different areas along the highway, and that helped quite a bit. One of the ordinances that they initiated and that we still enforce today is a leash law for dogs.
Now, again, you might not think that that would be such a big deal, but think back in the 1910, 11, and 12, there was no spay and neuter program, and dogs and cats, there were quite a population. So it was very beneficial to have a leash law, and people did start monitoring their dogs a little bit better. Along with their duties as the town council, the ladies naturally had their domestic duties. They had to bake the bread, they had to take care of the children. As a matter of fact, three of them had children while they were in office, so they were pretty busy. The ladies served from 1912 through 1913, and after those 2 years, they went back to their domestic duties and turned control back over to whoever wanted to run for city council. I think looking back, the thing that the women accomplished more than anything else is they served because they wanted to serve their community. They wanted to help. And I think that's something that we can all draw inspiration from today. Certainly we're proud of the girls, proud of the ladies, and we look back and honor them.
It wasn't that many years ago that the thought of operating on the human heart was unimaginable. In fact, doctors were once told not to even touch it for fear the heart would stop beating. But by the mid-20th century, that notion had changed, and a Utah doctor performed one of the first open-heart procedures in America. That surgeon was Russell M. Nelson. And from the time of that operation in 1955 right up until today, Utah has been a leader in cardiothoracic care. And while many accomplishments in this field can be credited to Utah doctors and hospitals, one stands out as the first and perhaps the most dramatic surgical procedure of its time: the implantation of a mechanical heart, the Jarvik 7, into the chest of a Seattle dentist born and raised in Utah, Dr. Barney Clark.
So the first artificial heart, it was an amazing event. I believe it was December 3rd, 1982, as I recall. And there was a team, really, that was involved in this. Some of the key players, of course, were Dr. William DeVries, who was the chief surgeon. And the one who was responsible for designing this particular artificial heart was Dr. Robert Jarvik. So this was the Jarvik 7 heart. And then we have Dr. Don Olson for all his work with animals that led up to its approval for use in the human being. And then those were key players. And then I have to mention Dr. William Kolff, of course, who really was the father of this whole program of artificial organs.
We want to prolong happiness. Kolff was a nephrologist, and his passion was to create artificial organs for every system in our body. He started working on the artificial kidney when he was a doctor during World War II in the Netherlands. He came to the United States after the war to perfect it, and Utah brought him here with a vision to build artificial organs for other systems. So Kolff comes here and develops a cardiovascular branch with the vision to develop the total artificial heart.
Our native heart has 4 chambers to it. It has one chamber that takes blood in, one chamber that pushes blood out to the lungs where it gets oxygen, that then comes back to a secondary reservoir chamber, pushes it to the main pumping chamber that goes to the rest of the body. So there's 4 chambers, 2 before the lungs and 2 after the lungs. And so that same concept has to kind of exist when we think about a total artificial heart. The Jarvik 7 pushes air in and out, and that air is what pushes the blood forward. So you have these big pneumatic tubes, as well as electricity, because you need electricity to make it do it. And the machine was, you know, one of those kind of things where if you walk down the hall with it, it literally, you have to clear the hallways to push it.
After all the approvals were taken care of, all the testing completed, and all the preparations were in place, it yet remained to find the proper candidate for this groundbreaking procedure. The patient needed to be someone who was not eligible for a heart transplant, had exhausted all avenues of treatment, and unfortunately, had no hope for recovery.
The development of the artificial heart was extremely interesting to me, and I kept close track of what Dr. DeVries and the team were doing in this regard. And about that time, I got a referral from Seattle, Washington, from a cardiologist who was taking care of a retired dentist, Barney Clark. He had been a smoker for many years and finally given it up, but Dr. Clark had severe heart failure, and it was clear that we didn't have really anything medically to help.
And about that time, I had an encounter with Dr. DeVries, and I asked him how his program was going, and he mentioned he'd just gotten approval to go ahead with his first artificial heart application. And I mentioned that I had a patient that might be a candidate and described to him Dr. Clark, and he took note of that, and he said that his team would be in touch with them, and I guess the rest from there is history.
And you're just going down the track.
Dr. DeVries took him to the animal lab and showed Barney Clark an implant of one of these devices, for which at the time, Clark said, there's no way, and you know what, that I want that done to me. And so he actually refused initially to get it done. But unfortunately, he had a few more complications, and it was thought to be that imminently, within days, that he might not make it. And so ultimately, he turned to his wife and said, hey, you know, let's do this.
Well, as Dr. Clark's referring cardiologist, I was kept in close touch with what was happening at the university, and I got word that he was going downhill very quickly and the operation was scheduled. I was determined to accept their invitation to be in the operating room, and I can remember it was a long operation, but it went quite well. There was one problem with the left artificial heart, and it had to be replaced with another one while he was on heart and lung machine, but that worked out okay, and the operation was completed by morning, and he was sent back to his intensive care unit room, of course, on a ventilator. And I wonder if this is going to get much publicity. I said, I suspect this will be in the morning papers. And of course, it got a lot of publicity worldwide.
More than 500 journalists came to the University of Utah Medical Center, and it was a media sensation, as you can imagine. The impact of this event to the field of cardiac mechanical support and heart failure was, I would say, tremendous. People woke up one morning and they realized that somebody has his heart removed and a total artificial heart was there. This was not anymore an exotic thing. It was real, and it was happening.
With attention focused on Barney Clark, people throughout the world waited for word surrounding the first person to live with a permanent man-made heart. And as days turned into weeks and weeks into months, hope increased that medical science was on its way to finding a real way to combat the devastating effects of heart disease.
You've become very famous through this whole thing. I don't know whether you're aware of that completely or not.
Oh, that's some wonderful full letters and so forth from all parts of the world. Plus the United States supporting me. Some of it I can't interpret.
It was a complicated course, but it really showed a proof of principle that the artificial heart could maintain normal cardiac output through all that time. And there were times when it looked like he was gonna be okay. By the end of the third month, we were making arrangements for his discharge. And then, unfortunately, things went down very quickly. And then on day 112, he expired.
At the time of his death, there was failure of his colon, probably first, second his kidneys, next his lungs failed, next his brain failed, and lastly, when the key was turned off, his heart failed.
We express our respect and sympathy to Mrs. Clark and her children, and especially to Dr. Barney Clark, who was, and I suspect is, a remarkable man, a pioneer to match these Western lands.
In the closing days of his life, Barney Clark saw this path as a way to give back and serve others. He understood the toll cardiovascular disease could take on a human being, and he saw this grand experimental procedure as a way to help relieve the pain and suffering for others. His gift to medical science has, in the intervening years, been responsible for refined biology to help the heart improve itself, the development of the left ventricular assist device, or LVADs, as well as other cardiomechanical support devices. But Dr. Clark was not the only member of his family to leave a legacy to the world.
As Dr. Clark's cardiologist, I got to know him very well, but not only him, but also his wife, Unaloy Clark. And you know, through this whole thing, she was so supportive of his decision to basically be, I think, a human pioneer, or one might even more crassly say a guinea pig for something that was dramatically different than anything that had been done before. And for many years after that, she became a volunteer, unpaid volunteer for the American Heart Association, giving dozens of speeches encouraging more funding for medical research to bring this technology along and move it along. And so I have to honor her as well as her husband for their wonderful donation to medical progress. And that's really happened as a result, I think, not in small part, of her contribution.
Yeah, I think history of the artificial heart and the story, legacy of Barney Clark set the epicenter in Utah. And so it created this foundation for us not only to just provide good clinical care, but to be innovative in our research. And also educate people. The trainees that came through here then went out across the country, across the world, to teach things that they learned here. And so that's kind of where we are right now. But we could not do what we're doing right now without the 30 or 40 years of what happened before us. And so that's one of the cool things about being here in the University of Utah.
As you know, the disease we are fighting is a global epidemic. Heart failure affects 1 in 5 after 40 years old. So this evolution of the cardiac mechanical support field of artificial hearts, it's a big contribution for this growing population of patients that they have no therapeutic options. And Utah has been at the forefront of the evolution of the field, and we are proud here because of the collaborative nature, the technological advances that took place, and the people that were involved. The experts that were involved from every discipline made Utah, for many years, the place, and still the place, for the advance of the cardiac mechanical support field. I would say this is probably one of the top contributions Utah had to medicine. And we are proud of this history and tradition.
This area, in the center of Barney Clark's hometown of Provo, serves as a memorial to a man who gave his all to help others throughout the world. When he agreed to allow his ailing heart to be removed and replaced with an artificial one, he was blazing a trail into the unknown. The doctors, nurses, technicians, and staff, along with the Clark family, and especially Barney Clark himself, were truly pioneers. And what more appropriate place to be a pioneer than Utah? As we've journeyed through the past and learned about some of the famous firsts this state is known for, I hope that you have a greater appreciation for the uniqueness that is Utah and gained inspiration from the men and women whose forward-thinking ideas and bold actions have brought worldwide attention to this remarkable place that we call home. Now it's time for us to go out, chart a course, gain strength from those that have gone before, and embrace our passions. By doing so, we may just find a way to make our own distinctive mark on our state, our nation, and the world.